Hello again, 122. In this video, we will begin Chapter 26, the Cold War, and in this first video, we will describe how U.S. President Harry S. Truman responded to the Soviet Union's domination of Eastern Europe. And in February of 1945, that's where this picture is from, the Big Three met at Yalta in the Crimean, and they were going to discuss what is going to happen in the post-war world. And FDR hoped that the decisions reached at Yalta would provide the basis for a stable peace in this post-war era. And the Allied occupation forces from the Americans, British, and French in the West and Soviets in the East were to bring about the end of Axis administration and to organize the free election of democratic governments throughout Europe. But within months after the German surrender, mutual distrust among the Allies, if it had ever truly existed, rapidly disintegrated, and the dream of a stable peace was replaced by the specter of a potential nuclear holocaust. And the United Nations, envisioned by its founders as a mechanism for adjudicating international disputes, became mired in partisan bickering. And as the Cold War between Moscow and Washington intensified, Europe was divided into two armed camps, while the two superpowers, glaring at each other across a deep ideological divide, held the survival of the entire world in their hands. And the collapse of the Grand Alliance brought this about. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and the problems begin in Europe. Soviet military forces occupied all of Eastern Europe and the Balkans except Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia. And everywhere their military went, they stayed. And this is a nice map that we can refer to. And this shows you what Europe looks like in the immediate post-war era. All of these areas are occupied by Soviet military forces in the East. This is the famous Iron Curtain that we'll talk about in a moment that Churchill describes, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. And in the West, the U.S. and other Allied forces secured that part of the continent. So there's Western Europe now and Eastern Europe. Western Europe, capitalist, democratic. Eastern Europe, communist, command economy. And it soon became apparent that the Soviet Union interpreted the Yalta Agreement much differently. Stalin refused to accept the Polish government in exile, headquartered in London during the war, and composed mostly of landed aristocrats who harbored a deep distrust of the Soviet Union. And instead, they set up a government composed of communists who had spent the war in Moscow. And similar developments took place in all the states occupied by Soviet troops. Yugoslavia was a notable exception to the pattern of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. The Communist Party there had led resistance to the Nazis during the war and easily assumed power once the war ended. Joseph Broz Tito, the leader of the communist resistance movement, appeared to be a loyal Stalinist. After the war, however, he moved to establish an independent communist state. Stalin hoped to take control of Yugoslavia, but Tito refused to capitulate to Stalin's demands and gained the support of the people and some sympathy in the West by portraying the struggle as one of Yugoslav national freedom. To Stalin, who once boasted, "I will shake my little finger and there will be no more Tito," the creation of pliant pro-Soviet regimes throughout Eastern Europe to serve as a buffer zone against the capitalist West may simply have represented his interpretation of the Yalta Peace Agreement and a reward for the many sacrifices suffered during the war. After all, they suffered some 20 million deaths, as you'll recall. And if the Soviet leader had any intention of promoting future communist revolutions in Western Europe, and there is some indication that he did, such developments would have to await the appearance of a new capitalist crisis a decade or more into the future. And as we saw from the map, the Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. And this was outlined by Winston Churchill in a highly publicized speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri in March 1946. The former British Prime Minister declared that an iron curtain, a metaphor, had descended across the continent, dividing Germany and Europe itself into two hostile camps. Stalin responded by branding Churchill's speech a call to war with the Soviet Union. And he need not have worried, though. Although public opinion in the United States placed increasing pressure on Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, to devise an effective strategy to counter Soviet moves abroad, the American people were in no mood for another war. And in an article in Foreign Affairs in July of 1947, also called The Long Telegram, George Kennan, a well-known U.S. diplomat with much knowledge of Soviet affairs, he was a keen observer of Russian and Soviet behavior. He advocated a policy of containment against further aggressive Soviet moves. Kennan favored an adroit and vigilant application of counterforce at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points, but mostly in the European theater, responding to the shifts and maneuvers of Soviet policy. And when the Soviets blockaded Berlin, and we'll see a picture, a map of Berlin at the end of this video, in 1948, containment of the Soviet Union became formal U.S. policy. The Truman Doctrine then comes out of containment. And Great Britain had initially assumed primary responsibility for promoting post-war reconstruction in the Eastern Mediterranean. But in 1947, continuing economic problems caused the British to withdraw from the active role they had been playing in both Greece and Turkey. And President Truman is alarmed by British weakness and the possibility of Soviet expansion into the Eastern Mediterranean. And he responded with the Truman Doctrine, which said in essence that the United States would provide financial aid and also possibly military aid to countries that claimed they were threatened by communist expansion. And you can read the entire speech that he gave on pages 681 to 82 in the textbook that says page 683, and that's an error. If the Soviets were not stopped in Greece, the Truman argument ran, then the United States would have to face the spread of communism throughout the free world, and that will become the domino theory. As Dean Acheson, the U.S. Secretary of State, explained, like apples in a barrel infected by disease, the corruption of Greece would infect Iran and all the East, likewise Africa, Italy, France. Not since Rome and Carthage has there been such a polarization of power on this earth. And that comes from J.M. Jones in 15 Weeks, February 21st through June the 5th, 1947. The second edition, New York Press, 1964, pages 140 through 141. And the Marshall Plan will be developed. And this was followed in June of 47. This was the European Recovery Program, and it's better known as the Marshall Plan, which provided $13 billion in U.S. assistance for the economic recovery of war-torn Europe. Underlying the program was the belief that communist aggression fed off economic turmoil. And General George C. Marshall had noted in a speech at the Harvard commencement that our policy is not directed against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. And that comes from W. Lacour, Europe in Our Time, New York Press, 1992, page 111. And although the Marshall Plan was open to the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states, Soviet leaders refused the offer as a devious capitalist ploy, and they refused to participate. It's unfortunate. They could have taken advantage of this. And Europe is now heavily divided and will remain so until the early 1990s. And this is Berlin, the city of the Cold War. And it's occupied by the Western forces, and this is over 100 miles inside of communist East Germany. This is a free Western-style capitalist area, whereas the Soviet zone is command communist. And This will be blockaded in 1948. They won't let anything into the western zone, and an airlift will be conducted to supply this zone around the clock for almost a year. And it succeeded, and eventually the Soviets stopped the blockade. And that ends this first part.